Unless private employment growth resumes soon, the United States risks falling into the same long-term economic sclerosis that has plagued the welfare states of Western Europe for decades. Already it appears that the past 10 years may prove to have been America's second lost decade, the 1930s having been the first. An interval of little or no net economic gain, owing to destructive government policies that produced only unsustainable booms, followed by inevitable busts, along with such huge, frequent, and unsettling changes in government policies that private planning, especially for long-term investment, has become too risky for private investors to bear. A situation my next guest calls regime uncertainty. I am paraphrasing from a column called Pity the Poor Private Sector Workers, written by my good friend, Professor Robert Higgs, Senior Fellow in Political Economy at the Independent Institute, editor of the Independent Review, and author of Crisis and Leviathan, still the most authoritative chronicle there is on the growth of big government in America. Professor Higgs, Happy New Year and welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thank you, Judge. I'm happy to be back.
I have to have you on periodically because of your incomparable knowledge of the history of American economics and your ability to compare throughout history that which is happening today. Are we better off now than we were 2 years ago when George Bush persuaded the Congress to give away $700 billion in the TARP program?
Well, as usual, Judge, it depends on who you include in we. If we are the people associated with Goldman Sachs, yes, we've done very well in the past decade. If we are associated with some of the big financial institutions that reaped billions of dollars and paid their executives billions of dollars during the past decade, certainly we are better off. But if we are the great mass of the American people, it's very unclear whether we've made any gains at all in the past 10 years if you compare right now with where we were, say, in the year 2000.
Now, I know that you're an economic historian and not a political scientist or a psychologist, but why doesn't the average person understand that the dollar bill in their wallet today can buy less than the same dollar bill in the same wallet a year ago, and that dollar bill bought less than the same dollar bill in the same wallet a year or two before that? And inflation isn't even rampant or runaway like it was in the mid-'70s.
Well, Judge, I'm sure that almost everybody understands that if they stop and think about the purchasing power of the dollar, they remember when many things were much cheaper in terms of dollar price than they are now. But in this country, the rate of inflation has typically been sufficiently slow that unless, say, gasoline prices run up quickly or something else that almost everybody consumes suddenly jumps in price, most people simply don't notice that inflation is eating away at the purchasing power of their money. And so it's just a question of magnitudes. If it gets a little quicker, they will begin to notice in greater numbers.
Chatting with Professor Robert Higgs from the Independent Institute. Professor Higgs, if the government continues to spend money that it doesn't have, if the president continues to borrow money at record rates, as we speak, the Treasury is seeking to borrow $159 billion today, the largest single borrowing in American history. How are they going to pay it back?
Well, I think if we think very hard about this question of repaying the government's debt, Judge, it's hard to conclude that they will pay it back. Now, of course, they may formally pay it back, but if they drive down the purchasing power of the dollar enough by driving up the number of dollars in circulation, then they can repay it in dollar terms while simultaneously defaulting in real terms. And I think there's a strong probability that ultimately the government will default in this sense. They may not simply tell everybody, look, forget your promises we made when you bought our bonds. We're not going to keep those promises, but the typical strategy or tactic of a government in this situation is to default by means of inflation.
I want to ask you about your phrase regime uncertainty, Professor Higgs. We have proposals before the Congress, which they will no doubt act upon before the spring, which would give the Federal Reserve, of all things, far more regulatory power than it already has, to rummage through corporate records without a search warrant, to second-guess corporate decisions without having given any money or acquired any equity in any of the corporations. What does this do to economic planning, and what does this do with respect to the uncertainty of investors and potential investors?
Well, it puts everybody at the mercy of Fed actions, Judge, and then, of course, people will begin to make guesses as they have for decades in the so-called Fed watching industry. People have watched the Fed with an eye to guessing what it's going to do about the money supply and about the interest rates it controls, because that's important for many financial planners. But in future, if the Fed has these extensive regulatory powers, it's going to widen the scope of Fed watching so that more and more decisions come to hinge on what people guess the Fed is going to do next.
Wow.
And this means that it's going to be a situation of such enormous uncertainty and uncertainty about things of such great consequence that it may well paralyze a large part of all the investment that otherwise would have occurred.
One would think that the government would have learned the lesson of the 30s, which you chronicle so beautifully in your book, Crisis and Leviathan, but it is apparent that the government has it. It's feeding us the same pablum and doing virtually the same things over and over and over again.